I'm Aiden, the chairperson of the Canada-Philippines Solidarity Organization. Though I was born and raised in Canada, I came to support the struggle for national democracy with a socialist perspective in the Philippines through the patient explanations of my friends and by witnessing the exploitation of Filipino people here in Canada. In April of this year, I traveled to the Philippines to observe the May 9th elections. After conducting interviews with community leaders, activists, and ordinary people, I was moved to action by the dozens of individuals who bravely shared their stories of government harassment, intimidation, for the simple act of daring to speak on behalf of their communities. Despite fearing for their lives, the people I interviewed felt it necessary to continue their work because the cost of silence would mean the continued suffering of their friends, families, and colleagues. Extrajudicial killings, shootings, abductions, death threats, illegal arrests, harassment, surveillance, red tagging, media suppression, voter intimidation. These are the cowardly acts of a government that wishes to remain unaccountable to the people that it allegedly represents. To fear the democratic and progressive voices of the people at a time when great social upheaval and economic crisis is a deplorable act that warrants the attention of the international community. Today I understand that it is not enough to know the suffering of the people. We must work together to change it. Today I see a brighter future for the Filipino people, where the fear and pain they currently experience form the basis for a fundamental transformation of Philippine society. And today I am proud to be speaking here alongside the members of the Filipino community that have chosen to take a stand and declare that their government must be accountable to the people. We know from history that it will continue to organize and mobilize the Filipino people towards national democracy with a socialist perspective. The international community can no longer turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses and crimes against humanity that have already and will continue to occur under this regime. By remaining silent, we become complicit. Join the Canada-Philippines Solidarity Organization. Join the national democratic movement. Let's work together as the Filipino people reject Marcos Jr. and hold Duterte accountable. Never again! Never again! Never again to martial law! Never again! Never again! Never again to martial law! Marquis Bagat! Marquis Bagat!
Olivia from ibat.
Good evening. My name is Olivia Blahuta. I am the Toronto Regional Coordinator for iChirp, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. For almost a decade, iChirp has connected human rights defenders, peace activists, academics, human rights organizations, and all freedom-loving peoples to come together in solidarity with the human rights defenders and victims of human rights violations in the Philippines. In the past year, iChirp has launched 2 large-scale international investigative activities in the Philippine human rights situation. The first was Investigate PH, which collected testimonials from dozens of victims of human rights violations in the Philippines in order to produce 3 detailed reports. We heard from mothers whose children were gunned down by policemen, from families displaced by Philippine military siege of their home in the city of Marawi. We heard from workers and urban poor facing inhumane conditions in their workplaces and in the community. We heard from migrants who were forcibly displaced by poverty, milked like cash cows, and abandoned during the pandemic. These stories were hard to hear. They touched our hearts, and they exposed us to the absolute rottenness of the ruling class in the Philippines and called us to action. But none of these stories are new. Our work with Investigate PH was part of an ongoing process in front of the United Nations Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court to hold the sick and cruel individuals who are responsible accountable for their crimes. The attention of the whole world is needed in this ongoing effort. So we support the Filipino people's call to hold Duterte accountable! Hold Duterte accountable! The second large-scale activity was something that I had the privilege to participate in directly. This past April, I traveled to the Philippines to take part in the International Observer Mission for the 2022 Philippine elections initiated by iChirp. For 3 weeks leading up to Election Day, we interviewed teachers and church people, farmers and fisher folk, market stall workers, journalists, politicians, and many more to learn about the conditions of the people in the context of the elections. All of these interviews pointed to the main conclusion of the IOM report as summarized, that no free or fair elections were held in the Philippines. This is why we support the Filipino people's call to reject the fake president. Reject Marcos! Reject Marcos! In consideration of the appalling human rights records of the Philippine presidents past and present, we must demand that the Canadian government take action. In 2019, the Government of Canada issued a document called Voices at Risk, which details their commitments to defending human rights. This includes meeting with human rights defenders, issuing public statements, attending court hearings. Despite these guidelines, Canada's embassy in Manila has completely failed to act. Our communications to the embassy have gone unanswered. The continued encouragement for them to act has been ignored. For example, they ignored our request to send observers to hearings of trumped-up charges against human rights activists of Karapatan Human Rights Alliance, whereas the European Union, Belgian, and Swiss embassies did answer those calls. Instead of holding to their own guidelines on protecting human rights defenders, the Canadian state is directly complicit in human rights violations in the Philippines. They provide military and financial aid to the Philippine government. This so-called aid is weaponized by the armed forces of the Philippines against churches, people's organizations, human rights defenders, and political opponents through tools like the anti-terror law and the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC. The Philippine government is terrorizing the Filipino people, and they're doing it in our name. iChurch Toronto calls everyone concerned about human rights to hold the Canadian government accountable and accountable to their commitments and to their complicity. Not another loony, not another dime, no more aid for fascist crimes. Not another loony, not another dime, no more aid for fascist crimes. No justice, no peace. Stop the killings in the Philippines. No justice, no peace. Stop the killings in the Philippines. The time to act is now. Talk to me to join iChurch today. Support iChurch's campaigns for the Canadian government to apply individual sanctions against the Dirty Dozen. Support iChurch's campaign for Canadian participation in the ICC investigation against Duterte's drug killings. Support iChurch's campaign to stop Canada's direct financial and military support to the Marcos II regime. Stand with the Filipino people in their rejection of Marcos Jr. And above all, support the Filipino people's right for true freedom, democracy, and development. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Olivia from iChurch. Ang tao, ang bayan, ngayon ay lumalaban. Ang tao, ang bayan, ngayon ay lumalaban. Reject Marcos. Reject Marcos. Duterte must pay. Duterte must pay. Our next speaker is Marisa Corpus, spokesperson of Malaya, Canada. Malaya movement in Canada seeks not only to broaden our opposition from Canada to fascism, but also to broaden Canada-based support for the cause of freedom and democracy in the Philippines. Marisa Corpus will be reading a statement, and Jojo Geronimo will also share a solidarity message.
Magandang hapon po sa ating mga kababayan. Sa Pilipinas, natapos na ang SONA kanina. At narinig natin ang mga pangako ni BBM. Napakarami daming malalalim na salita. Binitawan niya ukol sa ekonomiya na parang sinulat ni Jokno. Hindi naman niya salita eh, di ba? At mga economic team niya. Pero di ko nakita ang mga sagot sa tanong kung paano niya tayo aahon sa ating mga problema. Tulad ng pagbaba ng inflation, presyo ng mga bilihin, devaluation ng piso, Philippine sovereignty at iba pa. Ako ay nababahana dahil sabi niya science-based daw ang agrikultura at health sector. Pero bakit hanggang ngayon, wala pa rin tayong health secretary, wala pa rin tayong energy secretary at science secretary? Tahimik din siya ukol sa human rights, justice, peace talks, corruption, press freedom, at policies para sa mga small and medium enterprises that form 90% of business in the country. So in other words, ang pinoprotektahan niya ay mga bilyonaryo. Ha? Di rin niya mention kung ang Pilipinas ay sasali muli sa ICC. Sa tingin ko, improved version ito ng Duterte policy.